Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating historical text to unpack the actual realities behind the European witch hunts. You can totally forget those pop culture myths you've seen in movies, the blazing fires and instant mass hysteria. Because the truth buried in the historical archives reveals a surprisingly complex world where science, religion, and the occult were actually working completely hand in hand. Based on some incredible research dissecting witchcraft, demonology, and magic in Counter-Reformation Italy, we're going to take a bit of a journey today. We'll start way up high with sweeping socioeconomic theories, and then zoom all the way down to a deeply personal, incredibly human story. We're going to see exactly how these massive historical forces actually impacted everyday lives. So we're going from the grand, echoing halls of the Roman Inquisition straight to the bedside of a sick child.
It's such a compelling hook, and we really have to ask ourselves before we jump in, what actually happens when rational medicine collides with supernatural belief? Today, we see science and the supernatural as two totally opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Like oil and water. But back in the 16th century, that wasn't the case at all. Physicians and theologians were often looking at the exact same phenomena, but they were trying to explain them using this wild, blended framework of natural science and literal demonic intervention.
Okay, first things first, let's clarify our terms. The text we're looking at draws a very clear line between dangerous witchcraft and everyday esoteric magic. Witchcraft was defined very specifically as using supernatural means to cause harm, death, or misfortune. It's malicious, and it's exactly what fueled those massive historical panics. Magic, on the flip side, was more about esoteric knowledge, things like astrology or divination used for less dangerous effects. And this distinction is absolutely vital. It explains why certain practices were hunted down violently, while others were, sometimes quietly tolerated or just debated by academic scholars.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the witch hunts, we have to grasp what historians call the cumulative concept. This basically proves that no single event kicked off this huge historical phenomenon. Modern scholars completely rule out what they call monocausality. Basically, you can't just point the finger at one bad harvest or one overly zealous king and say, yep, that did it. It was like a giant, incredibly complicated puzzle. Historians literally have to piece together dozens of different factors to figure out why Europe suddenly woke up gripped by this massive fear of diabolical witches.
Honestly, it was the perfect storm. Around the year 1600, you had real climate change leading to devastating crop failures. And well, when people are starving, they immediately start looking for scapegoats. Now stack that on top of intense scientific debates trying to explain strange phenomena, plus bottom-up pressure from absolutely terrified villages demanding trials, and a new humanistic culture that was literally developing frameworks for how to hunt witches. All of these chaotic factors just rapidly stacked on top of each other to create utter chaos.
Which brings us to a really pervasive pop culture myth. Looking at all that sheer chaos we just talked about, you'd probably assume the Roman Inquisition was responsible for the absolute worst of the violent persecutions across Italy, right? We all share this collective cultural image of the Inquisition as the ultimate witch-hunting machine, just relentlessly fanning the flames of hysteria in every single town square. But here is the massive twist. The Roman Inquisition, which, by the way, was originally established back in 1542 to fight Protestant heresy, actually acted as a voice of skepticism. Yeah, you heard that right. The very institution we always associate with relentless persecution was remarkably cautious when it came to witchcraft in Italy. Their primary goal was stopping Protestantism, so whenever they saw these local panics over, village witches, they viewed them with a ton of suspicion and applied a really strict level of legal scrutiny.
In fact, the source text explicitly notes that the Inquisition managed to limit the operational liberties of the local dioceses. By centralizing all that authority in Rome, they effectively slammed the brakes on local zealots. They implemented highly specific legal provisions that required a seriously high burden of proof. And that move actually halted the violent anti-witch campaigns that had been completely ravaging northern Italy during the late 15th and early 16th centuries.
So, because the Inquisition was actively keeping a lid on these panics, the theoretical debates started to change hands. Early on, the guys writing those massive, heavy treatises on witchcraft were mostly inquisitors, primarily Dominican friars. But by the second half of the 16th century, the authors dominating the conversation were suddenly exorcists and medical physicians. The doctors were literally taking over the witchcraft debate.
To really grasp what the shift looked like on the ground, let's zoom in on a micro story. We're going to look at one specific guy, a 16th century Italian physician named Giovanni Battista Codronchi. He is a key figure in 16th century medicine, and his life perfectly encapsulates this wild intersection of health, politics, and the supernatural. This guy wasn't just sitting up in some ivory tower. He was right there in the messy, complicated middle of Counter-Reformation Italy.
Codronchi was incredibly influential, and his resume was honestly huge. He wasn't just a doctor. He was the commissioner for finances. He was a political ensign bearer for his city of Imola. Get this, during a plague threat in 1591, he actually advised the medical commission to start with spiritual commissions for protection. And, very significantly, he was deeply involved in Catholic censorship, eventually advising on the famous Index of Forbidden Books. For Codronchi, his politics, his faith, and his medical practice were all operating totally hand in hand.
Then, in 1595, Codronchi published this landmark treatise. It was called De Morbis Veneficis ac Veneficiis, which translates to On Poisoning Diseases and Poisoners. This wasn't a fringe pamphlet. It was a deeply earnest attempt to bridge the gap between medical science and demonic possession. So here we have a highly respected physician, a true man of science and state, writing a detailed clinical medical book about diseases caused by literal witchcraft and poisoning. But right here is where the story stops being just dry history and becomes so deeply human. You see, this book wasn't just some abstract academic exercise for him. It was tragically born out of the mysterious, diabolical illness of his very own daughter, little Francesca. As a medical professional, he was completely unable to cure her suffering using any of the traditional medicine of the day. And when science failed his own daughter, he was desperately forced to look elsewhere for answers. There's this deeply emotional pivot within his writings, where Codronchi actually admits his previous skepticism. He writes this line in Latin that translates roughly to, God allowed this witchcraft to happen so that I might experience in my own girl what I previously believed had little truth in others. It is such a stunning confession. He is essentially saying, look, I didn't really believe in this witchcraft stuff until I watched my own daughter suffer from it, and God used her pain to open my eyes. And that right there just brilliantly illustrates the entire era. Codronchi wasn't some cold, detached scientist. He was a desperate, grieving father trying to rationalize his daughter's terrible suffering. The only way he could possibly make sense of a disease that totally defied all his medical training was to look through the cultural lens of demonology. For him, the medical and the spiritual were truly just two sides of the exact same coin.
Following this profound personal realization, Codronchi really went on the offensive. He started aggressively connecting his medical profession with strict religious orthodoxy. First, as we saw, he published his treatise in 1595 to basically codify this intersection of medicine and the demonic. And then, just 2 years later, in 1597, he sent a massive letter directly to the congregation of the Index in Rome. He was actively using his medical authority to advise the Catholic Church on exactly which medical texts were spiritually dangerous and needed to be outright banned.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that early medicine and the occult were completely intertwined. We just can't look back at Counter-Reformation Italy and try to neatly separate the rational doctors from the superstitious religious figures, because as Codronchi's life proves, they were literally the exact same people. These belief systems shaped everything from high-level politics and the banning of books across all of Europe, all the way down to a terrified father just desperately trying to save his little girl's life. Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to chew on. We look back at a guy like Codronchi, or the Inquisition, with 400 years of hindsight, right? It's so easy for us to pick apart exactly where their science ended and their supernatural beliefs began. But centuries from now, how do you think future historians will judge the collision of our modern science, our cultural anxieties, and our deeply held belief systems? What perfect storms are we living through right this very second without even realizing it? Definitely keep that in mind the next time you think we've completely outgrown the past.